Good morning. I'm Dr. Sunanda Samatha Karada, co-hosting the John Telford Detroit Show with Dr. John Telford, coming to you live at 10 o'clock every Thursday morning on Wjzz Cool TV, streaming on Facebook, YouTube, and Twitter. Dr. John Telford is a former Detroit Public School superintendent, a former world-class athlete, and conqueror of Olympic champions. An championship track coach, poet, newspaper columnist, longtime civil rights crusader, and the author of 6 Detroit-oriented books: The Poet Emperor of Earth, What Old Men Know, Creative Insubordination, The Will Robinson Story, The Poetic Prancings of Mad John, his explosive autobiography, A Life on the Run, and another forthcoming poetry book, Athletes, Activism, and Apple Boughs, a Detroit poetic epic. He also has a show on WCHB AM 1340, Detroit's gospel station, Saturday mornings at 9:30 and Monday evenings at 6:30. That's Saturday mornings at 9:30 and Monday evenings at 6:30. His books are available at Barnes & Noble, Amazon.com, or just by calling the Good Doctor at 313-460-8272. That's 313-460-8272. Dr. John Talbert has been called a legend and also a lightning rod for controversy. He has received the Detroit City Council Spirit of Detroit Award and the Joe Louis Foundation Spirit of the Champ Award. He was named Wayne State's Alumnus of the Year, and a Detroit track was named in his honor. His email address is drjohntelford@aol.com. That's drjohntelford@aol.com. Now, without further ado, I present to you that crusading old native Detroiter, Dr. John Telford.
Thank you, Dr. Sunanda Corrado, that PhD from Columbia University, who is an anthropologist by trade. Dr. Corrado has been teaching at Wayne County Community College for, this past 10 years. And look at her, she looks like she's 17 years old, so how could she have been teaching there for 10 years? I can't figure that out. But Dr. Corrado has been teaching there for 10 years, and she's currently a researcher for the Detroit Equity Action Lab, which is housed in the Wayne State University Law School. And she is founder and CEO of Education by Design, which sponsored our symposium on Prioritization at the Detroit Yacht Club, this past December the 9th. Okay, this is supposed to be a poetry show, so I'm going to start with a poem. It's called Blue Salt. My name is Detroit. I'm a blue-collar town. Blue salt melts my mid-March snow. Speedy cars and sprinters spring from me. I father fierce fighters and funky music. In a Motown moment, I can spit the blues right back in a bureaucrat's eye. Have you never seen blue salt? No complex chemistry here. Only the old color of a new sky. And there's a new sky dawning over Detroit today, this morning, December the 23rd, 2021. Thursday, December the 23rd, 2021. On the WJZZ show here in the studio down here. Because we have got George Gaines in the studio with us today. George Gaines, the man who was the
Deputy Director of Public Health.
Coleman Young's Deputy Director of Public Health. And man, he knows where all the bodies are buried. We're going to be talking to George extensively,
And he's been involved throughout. In fact, he wrote his last paper on the water shutoffs that have been published, and he worked with We the People.
And that's some of the questions I wasn't going to ask him, but we will be asking you about that, George. We didn't consider that. But
Mr. Gaines has not stopped his efforts for us, and I thank you for that.
Well, he's had his finger in so many pies. He's also, he was a fine track man, a 2-miler.
Why athletes visionaries?
He set a 2-mile record on that 22 lap to the mile track that we had, and he ran under 10 minutes on that little fish dish, and that was a record. It was 9:58.5, and then Joe Babb took it down to 9:56.5. And, I go back with all these guys. George was ahead of me. He came out of Northwestern in 1949, and I would have come out of there in January 54 if I hadn't got kicked out of there and sent to live with my father, and then I finished up at Denby. But anyway, that's a little bit of history. But I got to say this before we really launch into interviewing George Gaines. Miss Virginia Starkey, fondly known simply as V, the proprietress of V's Boutique, offers a wide range of fine clothing and accessories for ladies, and you can find all sizes of women's fine apparel in V's one-stop excellent customer service at V's Boutique that you can't find anywhere else in Detroit anymore. V's is at 16423 East Warren, 16423 East Warren, over there by the Alger Theater, right around the corner from one of the few libraries that's still open. They've closed all the libraries, but 6 of them. But she is over in that neighborhood. She used to be, her boutique used to be in the River House for years, which is where she owns a place and I own a place, but now she's over on East Warren.
Next to the, right in the same vicinity as the historic Alger's Theater, right? So if you know where Alger's Theater is, folks, you know where V's Boutique is. Please go in. She's back to her original place of business. She started on the east side, and she's returned to the east side to not only open up a business, but also to mentor young people who are interested in business. So if you have a young person at home and they'd like to learn a little bit about business, please give Dr. Telford a call. What was it again? 313-460-8272,
and I'll steer you to V.
V's an active mentee and member of the community.
And she's done that with many young ladies. I mean, she's had a lot of protégés in there. But
There.
I have a couple other commercials, but I'm gonna defer them because we've got George in the studio today, and I'll go back later in the program. But George, welcome to the John Telford Detroit Show on Wjzz Cool TV.
Thanks for having me, John. It's
well,
good to be here.
It's an honor to have you here. I mean, you and I go back a ways. We didn't run together because you're a little ahead of me, both at Northwestern and at Wayne State, but you were one heck of a distance runner. I think you made all city at cross country at Northwestern. Okay, let me start. Tell us a little bit about the days when you were Deputy Director of Public Health for Coleman Young.
Well, that was a very interesting time because the health department was at full tilt. We had a medical director.
Speak right into the mic, George. Right into the mic.
We had a medical director. We had a large nutrition department that took care of home delivered meals. We had a $17 million a year substance abuse program to deal with the drug addiction problems and alcoholism problems in Detroit. We had a large environmental health program. It was a full tilt health department that Detroit was very proud of. And I was lucky enough to have Coleman appoint me to Deputy Director, and I stayed with him in that capacity for 17 years.
17 years. Now, none of these, were any of these programs extant before Coleman took office?
All of them were in place when Coleman took office. Okay,
but and here's a question, how did an African American from the 1920s, born in the 1920s, become the first black mayor of Detroit?
Well, it wasn't an accident. Starting really at high school and after it, Coleman was a labor organizer in the CIO. He was a
labor organizer during the Red Scare, right? In fact, Congress called him up several times.
Oh, yeah, yes. He had to talk to the House Un-American. My uncle did, too.
He was always under the threat of treason, trying to organize labor.
He knew my uncle. My uncle, Frank Telford, had to do the same thing. That was my father's younger brother by about 12 years. Frank Telford directed, Helen Hayes and all those. He was a big time Hollywood producer director who got in trouble because they thought he was a communist. His sister actually was a communist. That was Letty Telford, who was one of the founders of the Detroit Federation of Teachers. He was not a communist, but he certainly was a sympathizer, and he didn't work for a while.
Because I remember when I was looking at the Detroit Free Press, like back in those days, they wrote very anti-black sentiments in their newspapers. That's why you have to buy a subscription to get to their past efforts. It's amazing that Coleman Young comes in at that point to integrate labor first.
Yeah, well, the Free Press became a liberal paper, but then it's gone back to being corporate collusive now, along with the news and channels 2, 4, and 7, and we're dealing with all that.
But it was always anti-black until this moment, right?
Well, yeah.
Well, they didn't have any love in their hearts for Coleman, but he got to be mayor by being, first of all, a labor organizer, a civil rights activist, a member of the Progressive Party from 1947 to 1950, at which time he switched over to the Democratic Party and said that his involvement with the Progressive Party was a mistake, and it took him 15 years to get over it and get back into the Democratic Party. But that's how he got to be mayor. His background was he ran for city council and lost. Then he ran for state legislature and was hired.
That's when I met him. I met him when he was a state senator, if I recall correctly.
Well, he was state senator after he had been a state representative.
That's when I met him. I met him when he was a state senator. He followed. I don't know if you knew, but he was a fan of Cliff Hatcher's and Bullet Billy Smith, your old teammate, my old teammate later. But he knew those guys and followed their running careers and was I don't know if you'd call him a fan, but he was very interested in their success. He knew about Hatcher's 48.8 that he ran at Central High School, and he even followed Bullet Billy when he broke the world record for 65-yard low hurdles. He was acquainted with them, and he was also a close acquaintance of Charlie Primus.
Well, I met Coleman when I was a senior in Wayne State University. A friend of mine and a track runner from Stockton, California, Gordon Glenn Martin.
Oh yeah, Glenn, great half miler.
Great half mile, 157 half mile.
155.5.
155.5 half mile.
Yeah.
And he had spent time living in the same apartment with Coleman, and he introduced me to Coleman when Coleman was the executive secretary of the National Negro Labor Council.
I did not know that. I know Glenn
Wayne
was.
State was a hot spot at the time. This is like Wayne State was more radical than before the Black Panthers came out and all that.
Absolutely.
Amazing.
Glenn was very radical. He was dating a black girl. I can't remember the girl's name now. It's a while back, but.
Could you explain like Coleman Young in the era of Wayne State when you met him as a senior? Because Wayne State is so different now.
I think her name was Elise.
Well, Coleman was, as I was saying, was executive secretary of National Negro Labor Council, which was a radical organization organizing around labor and the blacks' support. And Coleman worked for them, and my friend Glenn Martin from Stockton, California, introduced me to Coleman, and I worked slightly with the National Negro Labor Council while Coleman was executive secretary. But that's how he got started. And then he went on to run for city council, lose, run for state representative and win, run for state senator and win 3 times, and said that the last time he lost an election was when he lost his state representative election on the east side, and then went on to win it and become a state representative and a state senator.
Do you remember which district?
I don't remember which district, but it was all on the east side.
Yeah, he was an alumnus of Miller when Miller was a junior high, if I recall correctly. He went to Eastern High School.
Graduated from Eastern High
But he went to Miller when it was a junior high, if I recall correctly. Am I right about that?
I'm not sure.
Okay. I think he was.
I know he graduated from
Eastern High, yeah. Came out, I think, around the same time Willie Atterbury came out, if you remember Willie Atterbury.
He thought that Eastern High was a good school. He said that Grosse Pointe would bus students into Detroit to Eastern High, which was on Grenner Highway, back at the time.
Yeah.
Because it was such a good school.
Yeah, it was. I remember Eastern very well. We used to run against Eastern when I was at Denby High.
And you're watching the John Telford Detroit Show, coming to you live, streaming on Facebook, YouTube, Twitch, Twitter, and other top social media platforms. Please like, follow, share, comment, and subscribe to us in other top programming that we have for you at this station. And thank you for watching Wjzz TV, the coolest station in the world. And today at the Ralston studio, we have Mr. George Gaines, the former Deputy Director of Health during the Coleman Young administration, and who has been working, I don't know where you get the energy, sir, but it almost seems effortlessly to me, up until the water crisis that we're facing today in the housing recession. Welcome to the studio. This is a true treasure for us.
Thank you.
Absolutely. And you know, George, you talk about Coleman Young's election camp. What does that exactly mean, and what was his election, quote unquote, camp?
Well, those were the people that were supportive of him when he ran for state representative, when he ran for state senator, and and who came to his annual conferences, which he did at Eastern High School, which became Martin Luther King High School. And every year he would do a conference that dealt with the issues of housing in Detroit, police brutality in Detroit, health services in Detroit, and that's where he built and kept his political support. But
I remember in the 80s he did a whole convention on kids getting kidnapped and raped in abandoned houses. I remember this because in the late 90s, when I was working with the schools,
Talking to your mic.
when I was working with the schools, kids were still complaining about abandoned houses being a safety issue. And Coleman Young had the first conference about children and safety about this. And it just seems like he put a lot of efforts out there that it could have been mind-blowing changes throughout the country. How come none of this has been received? He seemed very forward-thinking for its time.
well, going all the way back to high school,
Yeah.
Coleman was always a progressive, was always interested in the issues of civil rights
Oh, yeah.
in Detroit, which at that time there were restaurants in Detroit that you couldn't go to. There were hotels in Detroit that you couldn't go to. And Coleman and his friends and supporters were working in civil rights to correct that, not accident, but to correct that problem of having restaurants right in Detroit, which were actually supportive of Jim Crow.
So
Yeah,
he was right up
absolutely.
against the Black Legion, which was housed in Highland Park, and whose members were the Detroit Police Commissioner and the Highland Park Police Commissioner.
Talk into the mic.
He was really risking his life.
Yeah, well, yeah, he was risking his life.
'Cause that's an offshoot of the KKK, the Black Legion, right?
When he was called in front of the House Un-American Activities Committee, as was my uncle Frank Telford, they both refused to name names, and it cost my uncle dearly. It cost him, but in Coleman's case, I can remember a famous question that he asked the House Un-American Activities Committee, and you probably remember this too, George. Do you take me for a stool pigeon? That's what he said to them. You know, he was not in any way, shape, or form going to betray anyone or their names, and that's the kind of man that Coleman Young was. No one ever questioned that man's guts. I mean, he was one courageous dude. Go ahead.
So, in your notes to us, you have that Detroit in 1973 was 50% Black voters, but Coleman Young obviously won more than 50% of the vote.
Yes, he had a election camp of both Democrats and Black nationalists and UAW liberals, but the city by 1973 had become 50% Black voters, and he tapped into that in order to be elected mayor in 1973, and go on to take office in 1974 and stay there for 20 years until
20
he
years.
got ready to retire, and he retired.
Wow, yeah. And he had some white allies too, you know, which
No
definitely
question.
helped him.
Marianne Mahaffey.
Marianne Mahaffey, Mel Rabbits.
How did he hold that whole spectrum together, from black nationalists and radical groups that still exist today, all the way to Democrats to UAW members? How did he pull these completely different camps together under one campaign?
Well, he formed an alliance with Henry Ford II, and they were
Strange, huh?
and they were and they built the Renaissance. Really, isn't that right?
Right.
And it's still sitting there, even though it's not Ford anymore. It's GM. But anyway, what I'm going to ask you this. I think I already know the answer to it, but I'm going to let you answer this, George, because you know it as well or better than I do. What was Coleman Young's developmental approach?
Well, interesting enough, if you look at the economics of the situation, 1974 and forward, the city was at its lowest level. It was losing population with what was called white flight.
That's right.
It was losing capital, which was called capital flight, where auto
Businesses
plants
were
were
leaving.
moving
Yeah.
into the suburbs and leaving Detroit with abandoned factories. And Coleman had to develop around that. And he didn't let that stop him. He went on to save 2 automobile plants, the so-called Pulltown plant, which was really the Cadillac plant on East Grand Boulevard. He also saved the Chrysler plant. Chrysler was tearing down a plant on Jefferson, and Coleman convinced them, as they tore down one plant, to build another. So they were taking one down and building one up at the same time. So that was part of his developmental plan. He went on to develop the Dolores Arena, where the Red Wings played, and he expanded Cobo Hall. So in spite of the fact that Detroit was at its lowest ebb in terms of economics, Coleman continued to develop. It was not a barrier to him. It was something that he would do no matter what.
Yeah.
Because there were still jobs in Detroit, even though people were leaving. He made sure there were jobs still in the city.
Yes, but a part of this Detroit being at the lowest ebb was automation was coming in, and that was a strike against employment. And so
Especially against black workers who aren't given the highest level jobs in the unions.
not given the highest level and don't have the highest seniority. And automation was coming in, and Coleman was still saving plants, building plants. At the same time, they were taking plants down. But at that time, there were 20 plants moved from Detroit to the suburbs.
Wow. 20.
20 plants, over 20 actually. But that didn't stop him from developing.
Okay, I'm gonna.
My uncle worked in one of those plants when he came from India.
Oh, really?
So Coleman Young helped a lot more people than even he knows.
He was a friend of the common man, grassroots, all the way. I mean, that's. I mean, that's. I'm hoping that his son will do some of the same
His son's
things.
a doctor now in Vegas. My uncle's son. Without Coleman Young, this American dream would not have happened for my uncle's family.
Okay, I was talking about Coleman Young's son.
Oh yeah,
You know,
he's cool.
he's on the. Yeah, in fact, he's called into the show. He's on the city council now, along with some progressive people that may hopefully turn the council, into a real organ that does the right thing and just isn't a rubber stamp for.
And the services that Coleman Young kept up, they always talk about it as a black-white issue. But immigrants who were coming into the metro area came in through the city, and if it weren't for Coleman Young's reign over the city, a lot of immigrants would not have been able to achieve the American dream that they think is from Michigan and not from Detroit itself.
Yeah, well, you would know a lot about that, Sunanda.
And my father's retired. He owned a plant as well. We're very much immersed in the automotive industry.
Your father owned a
My,
plant?
my family, most South Asians are in the medical industry,
Yeah.
but my father was in the automotive industry, and that's why this history means so much to me.
By South Asian, Sunanda means she is of East Indian extraction. Her maiden name was Samadar, if I recall correctly. And now, of course, she's got the name Corrado. So
Sicilian.
yeah, you know, East Indian and Sicilian, an interesting combination. But let me say this before I forget: Mark Blank Sr. and Mark Blank Jr. run Sinbad's Restaurant at East Jefferson on the Detroit River. East Jefferson on the Detroit River, and it's on the east side, and it's, in my opinion, and I'm not being paid to say this. This is not one of my paid commercials. Sinbad's Restaurant. Even though I love the river, the restaurant in the Detroit Yacht Club, you know, I eat there all the time. I'm a member. I believe that Sinbad's Restaurant is the best restaurant in the city of Detroit. That's my own humble opinion.
So, Mr. Gaines, what were the prioritization of public health issues during your tenure with Coleman Young?
Well, first of all, high infant mortality in Detroit had to be an issue because Detroit had statistics in infant mortality that were comparable to third world countries. So infant mortality, drug addiction was a major problem. There were 40,000 heroin addicts in Detroit.
It's still a problem.
This was during the
Still a
beginning of the
problem.
crack epidemic, so to speak.
But Young Boys Incorporated
Oh,
was
yeah.
a big drug selling gang on the east side.
Was Maserati Rick involved with them? Was he part of that
Yes.
operation? I thought so.
Yes, and that ended up getting him to go to prison for over 20 years.
Yeah, well, when he came
He
out,
was-
he was instrumental in killing my godson.
He was a young teenager
Yeah,
when he
When
went to work for Young Boys Incorporated.
yeah.
But high infant mortality, drug addiction, alcoholism, and as if we needed it, HIV or AIDS became a problem, and we had to deal with that because it was a public health problem. And I went to Coleman and
Didn't
asked,
you have some harm reduction kits for addicts and needle exchange and some of that stuff? Wasn't
yes, we
Coleman
did,
Young
but I had to
responsible
go
for?
to Coleman and ask him if it was permissible for us to put drug reduction kits together and needle exchange programs to deal with the problem of HIV. It was called, at that time, harm reduction, and that
Right,
was
yeah.
and that was part of the major thrust of the health department. Harm reduction, which was needle exchange, kits for drug abuse. We put bottles of 5%, 5%. What do you call it? For cleaning
Oh, yeah.
the needles.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I went to Coleman. He said, "Give him the needles." He was progressive in that regard. He thought it was a fine thing for people to come together and do a needle exchange program. And he was all for it.
And this was all in your capacity of Deputy Director of Public Health for Coleman Young in the Young administration. This is George Gaines, the Deputy Director of Public Health in the Coleman Young administration on the John Telford Detroit Show, today, December the 23rd, 2021, and we need another commercial.
And you're watching John Telford Detroit Show, coming to you live, streaming on YouTube, Facebook, Twitch, and Twitter, and other top social media platforms. Please like, follow, share, comment, and subscribe to us and other programming available to you at this station. And thank you for watching Wjzz Cool TV, one of the coolest stations in the world and one of the few black-owned stations in Michigan. And we're here with Mr. George Gaines, former Deputy Director of Health during Coleman Young's tenure, and we're talking today about the public health crises that he was facing back then, and how, ironically, a lot of these crises have been ebbed. Now, in terms of infant mortality rate, Black women in America, Detroit I'm not so sure of, but America in general, is still the same as third world countries. And in fact, you're more safe to give birth anywhere if you're a Black woman, but in America. So
the richest country on earth, you know, that is totally a disgrace.
And then a lot of the drug addiction, HIV, and harm reduction programs you had seem to be very parent-centered and family-centered. So I'm wondering, to your knowledge, how much of these intervention programs are still here and available for families, and how much you think that these programs are necessary for families to survive, not just people?
Well, HIV continues to be a serious problem in Detroit and in the rest of the country.
Yes.
And needle exchange programs continue to give addicts needles for old needles. You turn in your old needle and you get a fresh needle, and encouraged not to share it, because that's how HIV was transmitted between addicts. And so the needle exchange program was part of harm reduction.
Well, drugs are still a big problem too, and I'm not just talking about marijuana and cocaine. I'm talking about heroin. I can remember, you know, when I was running at Wayne State, I was a junior, and I had a lady who danced on 12th Street. She wore my leather sweater for a while. She was a little bit older than I was, we were together for a very short period of time. But 30 years later, I read her obituary.
Wow.
And the heroin got her. It was the heroin that got her, and it was heroin that's gotten. I don't know what the statistics are. You may be probably are more familiar than I am regarding that, George. But heroin has been a real problem, and it's killed a lot of Detroiters. I don't know if it's been quantified or not.
And then this.
Let him answer this. I want to see if.
Yes,
Well, we had for a time thought that there were 40,000 heroin addicts in the city of Detroit, and we kept saying that, and so we did a study, an epidemiological study, and we looked to find every heroin addict in Detroit. We looked at the courts, we looked at the jails, we looked at the clinics, and we counted, and it turned out there were 40,000 heroin addicts in Detroit.
Yeah.
And we did that study twice. We did it once, and then we did it 10 years later, and there was still 40,000 heroin addicts in Detroit. But we continued to say that there were 40,000, but we said it with authority, because we had actually done a scientific study to find them and to count them, and then to talk about where the 40,000 lived.
It's a devilishly deadly addiction. I mean, I can't think of anything worse than heroin addiction when it comes to mortality of users.
Now, these addictions and acts of deprivation, right, and desperation have led to Michigan being one of the top states in human trafficking. I just don't understand. When he started with these programs, like, he knew what we needed to resolve. And now I don't see these programs half as available. And I have to correlate drug use with a little bit of our illiteracy problem now.
They're all interchanged. I mean, there's no question about it. And we could talk about, you want to start talking about the schools, I'll talk about that for a whole new program.
It just seems like his platform was to save families, in a way, to save the community. I haven't seen something like that since then.
Well, we were very fortunate at the time that things were really rough in Detroit. Detroit Health Department got a $5 million grant from the Community Foundation to do family education for pregnant women as a drug, as a reduction of infant mortality. Family education to teach women who were pregnant to give up smoking, to eat properly, and to live a healthy life during their pregnancy, so they would give birth to a healthy, strong infant. And so family education through this foundation grant was helpful to keep the Detroit Health Department going.
Didn't he start up a family health care wasn't it a building that he started up, a family health care for pregnant women and for some of the other things you just mentioned?
Yes, with Coleman's permission, Detroit Health Department went after homeless people in Detroit.
Right, homeless, right.
And got a grant from Johnson Foundation to do primary care for homeless people, and that became family health centers. And I think there are about 4 or 5 of them in Detroit right now. But they all started with a foundation grant from Johnson Foundation for homelessness, and became family health centers in Detroit. So in spite of the fact that things were rough in Detroit, Detroit continued to do development because Coleman's point of view was that we had to keep going even though things are rough.
And do we still have these family health centers?
Yes, we have about 5 or 6 of them in Detroit right now.
Why aren't they well promoted? Because I know a few years ago, Wayne State University was sued for $60 million in Medicaid fraud. Why aren't our people going to these family health centers?
Well, the family health center that I'm most familiar with is called the John Waller Health Center. And it's on Woodward and Warren in the Wayne State University area. And it's named after John Waller, who was health director under Coleman Young, who came from New Jersey to Detroit to be the health director, who was an epidemiologist himself from the University of Michigan School of Public Health. And he was director of the health department and then went on to become community director of health at Wayne State University Medical School. So he started the family health centers with money for homelessness.
When you say money for homelessness, did they house the homeless in these centers?
No. It was primary care. Medical care.
Medical care.
Oh, okay.
Medical care.
Because, we've got about 30,000 homeless right now in the city, and I'm not sure what they're...
I know people who are educated, who teach at the university system, who cannot get health care right now. So let's go from biological health to mental health. At the time he was elected, like you said, it was 50% black voters, and yet he came through with this campaign promise. He dismantled stress.
Oh,
the stress unit. Can you explain stress?
That was one of his major accomplishments. We'll let George talk about that.
And the morale that stress had over black folk in Detroit.
That was just a license to execute black men, almost without any provocation.
And I resent that they made a movie about stress and called it Detroit. This was not a movie about Detroit. It was about stress unit.
Well,
Stop the robberies, enjoy safe streets. Wasn't that the acronym?
That's right.
Yeah.
And in that domain, they killed 21 black men and 1 white man in downtown Detroit under the auspices of stress. And at the time, I was working at Wayne County Community College, and I went to Coleman and asked Coleman what his position was on stress, and he said that once he was elected, he would dismantle it, and once he was elected, he did.
He did. In his first year, he did.
The first year.
Yeah, I remember that.
And that was a coalition, interestingly enough, between Coleman Young and the rest of the progressives in Detroit who were against stress, including Ken Cockrell.
Yes.
So as you can imagine, Ken Cockrell, who probably would have succeeded Coleman as mayor.
He would have. He would have.
And Coleman were together on getting rid of stress, and Coleman dismantled it as soon as he took office in 1974.
Ken Cockrell the elder.
That's why we have such a good, not a good, but it's such a different relationship with the police in other urban areas.
Yeah, I was just going to mention Ken Cockrell the elder used to go into Mackenzie Hall down at Wayne State with me and with Cliff Hatcher when he was, I don't know what he was doing, getting his law degree or what. I was working on my doctorate. But he came, and Cliff had just come back. He had re-enrolled at Wayne State because he didn't graduate when he was supposed to. And he never really did graduate. He opened a men's clothing place. But Cliff Hatcher, who was my old relay teammate with Bullet Billy Smith, and Ken Cockrell, the elder, and my cousin Judy Telford, who was studying nursing, and a friend of Ken Cockrell's, whose name I can't remember now, but we used to go into Mackenzie Hall down at Wayne State, and Cliff would have a bottle of rum in his briefcase. So we would order Coke, and then Cliff would sneak the rum into our Cokes and sit there. And that guy who was with Ken Cockrell,
history got done.
yeah, the guy who was with Ken Cockrell had a crush on my cousin Judy, Judy Telford, who was a beautiful girl. She's about 6 years younger than me. But anyway, that's just an aside. Let's get back to Coleman Young.
Well, stress was an issue that Coleman and Ken Cockrell agreed on, and I was active with Ken Cockrell as a person who was progressive in Detroit.
Oh, yeah.
And they asked me to go to Coleman and ask Coleman what he would do about stress. And I wrote Coleman a letter and then met with him, and Coleman said that he would get rid of stress, and he did. He had a campaign promise to get rid of it, and he got rid of it the first year. And that was the end of stress in Detroit. As I said, there were 22 people killed, and 21 of them were black men that were shot by stress officers in Detroit. That was a real bad scene.
So it must have been hard to get rid of stress in the middle of white flight.
Not really.
Really?
No.
Can you say a little bit about that?
Coleman was determined to not only get rid of stress, but to integrate the Detroit Police Department. There were less than 6% of the officers who were black, and Coleman wanted to see the police department look like the rest of the city of Detroit.
Yeah, because we were 50% black and growing.
And
growing
he had the
black.
residential requirement, didn't he, for his city service?
Yes, there
Yeah.
was a
They should-
residential requirement.
That should be restored.
Because most of
I still believe
because our police might be integrated now, but most of them don't live in the city.
Well, they
most of
should.
them are not residents.
They should be living in the city.
So I mean,
At that time, they had to live in the city, and he went from 60% to what he was looking for was 50%. Since half the population were black, and he thought that half of the patrolmen and officers in the police department ought to be black also. So he not only got rid of stress, but he began to integrate the Detroit Police Department.
Well, Ken Cockrell was totally opposed to stress, and he certainly was an ally to Coleman Young in getting rid of stress. I want to say this about Ken Cockrell, because I brought him to Butzel Junior High School to talk to my kids when I was an administrator there, and then I brought him to King, and he talked at King too, because he was a proponent of keeping grammar instruction in the schools, which had been phased out, and which still is phased out, and which I was going to phase back in when I was superintendent, but I never got the chance. But Ken Cockrell had a golden tongue, and he spoke perfect grammatical English, and he expected that all our kids should be able to do that. He wanted them to be able to talk like the man talks on television, and he wanted them to be able to write like Hemingway. He was a very literate individual, Ken Cockrell Sr. I just want to get that in. Okay, you were going to ask a question.
So when you were working over the different troubles of the city, capital flight was the problem. But the problem the city seems to find itself in now is that there's all kinds of capital coming in, but nothing's being spread.
Nothing's
being spread, meaning all kinds of money and wealth and companies are coming into the city. So before we had capital flight, but now we have all kinds of capital being dropped on the city, but it's not being spread. The wealth isn't being spread to the residents.
It's going downtown and in the news center.
Yeah, and nothing again to the east side. Because as you kept saying that he came from the east side, and the east side was the most well-organized, right, of the city in terms of coming up with resistance to a lot of things that were happening with the administration before Coleman Young.
Well, the organizing of the east side of Detroit, you could really lay at the feet of Coleman Young, because he was active in organizing it in order to run for office, and he even had the idea that before he ran for office, he would be progressive in seeing to it that grassroots people got what they should in Detroit. So his basic idea in developing over the long term was that Detroit had to be organized around labor, and he continues to be a labor organizer, even though he was running for office.
And in fact, didn't he support the black students at Wayne State University when they held a study-in and took over one of the administrative offices, demanding an African American Studies department? He literally encouraged them. I've never seen a mayor be so proactive in the identity of the city and its citizens.
He was very tight with Helen Moore too. Yeah, it was kind of under the. Yeah, it was kind of under the radar. You know, they didn't keep they didn't make their alliance public, but and Helen can talk more about that when she comes on this show again. But they formed a very definite alliance because.
But he encouraged a lot of university students and their aspirations for the city. And I found that amazing because when I was talking to Chris Rutherford, he was a black student, but there were also 2 Jewish students and other students who helped organize it. The reason they were encouraged or felt a certain idea of confidence that they were going to get something out of it was because of the support that the administration gave them for having a Black Studies department at Wayne State, which is, again, under attack maybe right now. But then we went from white flight, which was a problem then, not anymore, to capital flight, which was a problem then, not anymore. Now we just don't get the capital coming in. To the auto economy, which was dominated by the Japanese industry back then. But now we don't have an auto economy.
Well, at the time that Coleman was was elected in 1973 and took office in 1974, the auto economy was dominated by Japanese industry. That would be 1972 and 1973 and forward. And then Coleman, in other words, had to take charge of a city that was losing its automobile plants, was losing its automobile workers to automation, and he had to still deal with the economic turndown. And he did that by getting $35 million for the library, for the zoo, for the Art Institute. He also did that by saving 2 automobile plants, the Poletown plant, which again I say was the Cadillac plant, the Chrysler plant, and developing Joe Louis Arena, which would have gone to the hockey arena would have gone to the suburbs had it not been for Coleman deciding with no money to build the Joe Louis Arena, and he did that.
How do you do that?
It's a question about how he did it right now, but he had no money and built the Detroit Arena and had a successful campaign to raise the city taxes, income tax, which hard for any person running for office to raise taxes. But he had a program called Vote Yes, which was a grassroots program on the east side of Detroit to get people to go to the polls and vote to raise taxes on themselves. And that campaign was successful, and it was what Coleman said was a campaign that saved winning Detroit's grassroots outreach.
Yeah, and that was last commercial.
We don't need it. Oh yes,
yeah,
and you're watching the John Telford Detroit Show, coming to you live on Facebook, YouTube, Twitch, and Twitter, and other top social media platforms. Please like, follow, share, comment, and subscribe to us and other important programming that we provide to you on WJZZ. And thank you for watching Wjzz Cool TV, the coolest station in the world. And today in our Ralston studios, we have Mr. George Gaines, former Deputy Director of Public Health for Detroit under Coleman Young's tenure. And so I guess if you don't mind me asking my last question before.
Sure, go ahead.
Yeah. So what do you think about what the city is doing with the legacy that Coleman Young has left us? As you can see, all the libraries are closed down. Wayne County Community College only has 1 library on its 5 campuses that are open. The zoo is in Royal Oak, and I appreciate that we own it.
It's always been there.
But the DIA, even though we own the DIA, the management has been turned over. We're still under emergency financial management in a sense in terms of some of our greatest assets in the city. What do you think is happening to Coleman Young's legacy? We know Joe Louis Arena isn't the same
They
anymore.
tore Joe Louis Arena down. We
Yeah.
got to name something after Joe Louis
Are
now.
they trying to erase it and just put him
Great
onto a
heavyweight
stamp?
champion.
Well, actually, the Joe Louis Arena was lost excuse me, was lost when the city went into bankruptcy. And Joe Louis Arena was one of the institutions the city gave up. But the Poletown plant, right,
Yeah.
is still in existence,
Yeah.
though it's not the Cadillac plant anymore. And Chrysler is building another plant on the east side of Detroit. So there are still things that Detroit has that were started when Coleman was mayor, and when he was developing in the face of what he called the lowest ebb of Detroit's tax situation. In other words, he said that by vote yes campaign and electing to save the city with raising the taxes on income, it saved the city from disaster. So some of the things that Coleman did still exist in spite of the fact that we've had 4 or 5 new mayors since his last year.
In fact, you said Bing, who came in, actually tore down a lot of the funding for the health programs that were intact until he came in.
Yes, Bing didn't do anything to raise the Detroit Health Department. As a matter of fact, when he left office, the Detroit Health Department was down to 5 people, if you can believe that.
Man, and now we have $800 million and no one to play with it.
Well, we've reached the end of our time, but I want to thank George Gaines, Coleman Young's Deputy Director of Public Health, for coming on the John Telford Detroit Show today. The Dr. John Telford Detroit Show, which is co-hosted by Dr. Sunanda Corrado, Columbia University PhD. And thank you for coming on the show today, George.
Well, we had a good opportunity to go over a lot of things that happened while Coleman was mayor, and I appreciate you having me here. Thank you for bringing me on.
Okay, my brother.
Mr. Gaines, we have to bring you back on for your own personal experiences as well. It's been such a treat for me, and thank you. You've been listening to the John Telford Detroit Show with Dr. John Telford and co-host Dr. Sunanda Samatha Corrado on Wjzz Cool TV on Thursdays from 10 to 11 in the morning, streaming on Facebook, YouTube, and Twitter. You know, it was the late, great Dr. Wayne Dyer who said that Dr. John Telford has a warrior's heart and a poet's soul. Please listen also to Dr. John Telford on Wchb AM 1340, Saturday mornings at 9:30 and Monday evenings at 6:30. And please tune in again next Thursday morning at 10 o'clock. And thank you for listening. Good
Good
morning.